Hello, I'm Chester Connell, and this is our final segment of Unrendered. Our guest, Halimah DeShong. Halimah, let's talk about terms that are used, and let's see if we can start learning the language of LBGT and embracing a reality that has been with us ever since we were Homo sapiens. Homophobia and transphobia, what is that?
So homophobia has to do with, well, it started really as a psychological term to talk about the fear of being outed as homosexual, or the fear of being outed as gay. But since then, within the LGBT movement, there has been a sort of way in which they've politicized the term to talk about the forms of discrimination, the forms of violence, the kinds of ways in which experienced by LGBT persons, the ways in which the persons might be discriminated in terms of employment and access to employment, the ways in which there are particular laws that kind of militate the boundaries of their humanity and so on. So it is also used to look at the structural impediments in the way of persons who are identified as LGBT of experiencing their full citizenship rights. In terms of transphobia, it talks about, similar to homophobia, the kinds of discrimination, hatred, violence that might be meted out to a person because they identify as transgender.
And what is transgender?
And to be transgender, so an individual who is maybe biologically male, but their gender identity may not be masculine. So they may be biologically male, but their gender identify as woman. Or a person who is biologically female, but their gender identity is that of a man. So persons are very adamant about which pronoun should be used. A transgender woman prefers she, he, they. So for some individuals, they prefer to go by the pronoun they because they draw on elements of manhood and womanhood. For some individuals, they prefer the pronoun. For a trans woman, she may prefer the pronoun she, a trans man, the pronoun he. And there's a sense in which, and this is where the kind of education comes in, because for instance, in that documentary I was referring to earlier, they talk about how it might just make sense to ask someone. So you may not be sure. So you might be doing an interview, you before the interview begins, you start asking the person, how do you prefer to be referred? What is your preference? Sorry, and it is not. There is a way in which you have to kind of know your limits. Like there are questions you won't pose to an individual who you might not identify as within that community. The same boundaries apply, the same boundaries around privacy. That individual will tell you as much as they're willing to tell you about themselves. So the same boundaries of privacy and respecting a person's rights and so on apply.
So you see that there are people who would like to be referred to as they. They see themselves as two in one?
For some people.
As having both male and female?
For some people.
I see.
Yes, and that's the whole idea of being trans or being in transition and so on. For some people, they prefer the singular pronoun. For most people, I think.
And transphobia is a phobia of whom? Of the person?
The trans, the person who identifies as trans woman or trans man. And it's beyond phobia. It also signals the kinds of discrimination a person may experience. So one of the key areas for trans persons who identify as trans women and trans men is in the area of work. Because there may be some knowledge or some perception that this person may actually be biologically male and their gender identity does not match that sex reality. There's a sense in which they may actually experience discrimination because there's some expectation of that person as not conforming to what their gendered identity should be. So this is some of the work being done by activists in the Caribbean, and the ways in which simply what is being asked for is kinds of respecting an individual rights as citizen. Too often I think the discourse gets kind of sidetracked with, focusing on HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS is a problem for all of us in the Caribbean, whether you're heterosexual, whether you identify as LGBT, it's a problem for all of us in the Caribbean. So it is a danger with locating the discussion around that, because again that reinforces particular kinds of stereotypes around sexuality and so on. So I think people make pronouncements without listening to what is being asked for by activists. And what is being asked for is very just fundamental in terms of, you know, humanity, citizenship rights, and so on. Some of the basic rights.
So, word to the journalists, we can ask questions before we do interviews. It is now apropos, it is now appropriate to say...
And some newspapers do. Some newspapers actually have taken the stance of using the pronoun that the individual is most comfortable with in terms of how they identify. Others may not. So right? Most do not.
So we do not say, are you gay, lesbian, trans? That's not the question to ask you.
I don't think I would ask anybody that question unless they are sharing this information. No, I wouldn't, because unless they're sharing this information because they might be functioning in that space as an activist, and they're using their own personal experience to kind of promote their activism. I actually think regardless of what you may feel about someone, because we make perceptions about people based on whether we think they might be male, but their gendered identity in terms of in terms of mannerisms, behaviors, and so on, may look to you as the person is engaging in feminine behavior. We somehow become fixated on that and forget about the ideas.
So what are we asking them?
What I'm asking people is to treat people like people.
Right.
That's the basic thing, that you do not create boundaries of who qualifies as a human being.
Right.
You do not create boundaries around that.
But with the pronoun,
and that if you're doing an interview on fisheries, the question of sexual identity should never intervene unless the interview, and even if I turn up to do an interview about sexual identity, a journalist should never think it's their right to ask me about my sexual orientation, unless I'm willing to offer that information.
I want to take it from the point of view of you saying he, she.
I get you.
Yes.
I would go and I would go beforehand and ask for information. And to say that this is not, we assume that somehow there are more progressive views which exist in other countries. And there may be individuals with more progressive views, but there are a lot of people who are in the media and other places who actually do not have, they would ask persons some of the most inappropriate questions. A very famous journalist asked a trans woman outright, so have you had a sex change? Which was so, I mean, that is a serious violation.
That is epistemic violence.
And that trans woman was there to talk about a film.
Right.
That was there to talk about a film that she just completed.
That is a form of epistemic violence.
Form of gender-based violence as well, because
it's just being rude.
Absolutely.
Do you think that in the Caribbean we are getting to the point where LBGT is the norm? And I'll give you an example. One particular campus, I saw an ad for somebody who was a landlord was advertising his place for rent, and it said must be LBGT compatible. So I was actually taken aback that this person was quite comfortable with saying that the landlord was LBGT.
That seems very rare. Like I've never seen sort of any, and it may be as well because of a recognition that for this particular group, the marginalization is sort of everyday and in your face. So what you can do in terms of your own politics to ensure that this person from this particular group, these persons are protected, that you may extend yourself like that. But I don't think there's anything that, I don't think we're there.
Okay, yet.
I don't think we're there yet. And I think if it is worth having a conversation with people, like starting from the place of talking, regardless of how you might feel about, whether your kind of belief systems might prevent you from actually seeing, you know, it shouldn't be a question of right or wrong.
Do you think that you...
I think that it shouldn't be a question of right or wrong in sort of the religious sense, right? Because you're talking about individuals. There's this way of constructing persons whose sexual orientation may not accord with the mainstream as somehow villains,
yes,
in so many ways. Yes. And some of the most backward excuses are used to why they should be at the fringes of society.
Yes, yes.
It doesn't make sense.
Do you think that the University of the West Indies in particular should lead the charge of the Light Brigade in there? It was on a university campus that I saw this LGBT compatible sign. And because I remember on my own university, there was a chapter. You know, they're Greek, they're Greek organizations, and they're all sorts of on campus, on any university campus. And there was a chapter, and it was a Roman Catholic university. There was a chapter for gays, and you had to respect the privacy of the persons when you came there to support. You weren't coming there to find out who was gay and who was... and that was surprising to me. Wow, they actually have a chapter where gay people can gather and talk about it. Do you think that we should do that sort of thing?
I think it's already happening in some ways, because you have persons who are in the Faculty of Law who have given, provided legal counsel for groups claiming rights in different countries in the Caribbean. You have, for instance, Tracy Robinson. She is now the chair of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and a lot of her activism, in her public activism, in her writing and so on, she has championed sort of the claims for rights and justice of LGBT persons. You also have other persons in their writing, in their, you know, sort of giving support to groups doing this kind of work. And I would really like it if, before pronouncements are made, we actually, whether you completely disagree with what is being called for, you actually listen. And not, what I find sometimes, I've been reading articles where I see some of the things that are reported that LGBT persons and groups are claiming are so far from the truth. Like, so it is clear that somehow the message is getting distorted, and rather than listening directly to what is being asked and what is being said, people are actually...
They're going through their filters.
Yeah, they're actually distorting the truth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Our statutes, our laws reflecting the progression to LGBT and understanding that?
Well, you know, I always say, enshrined in most of the constitutions across the Caribbean is the whole principle of fairness and equality. And there are no limits. There's nothing that says fairness on this basis but not on that basis. The highest law of the land enshrined there is fairness and equality. However, in spite of legislation, you still have human actors. So legislation and legislative reform is but one area in which we need to sort of think through how we, not only for LGBT groups, protecting children, protecting, protecting the elderly, protecting persons with disabilities. And I think that is an area that we haven't thought enough about. Persons with disabilities and their specific needs. And we see the physical disabilities, sometimes we don't see the mental disabilities. So I think we have some work to do, not just in legislation, but also in cultural shifts, which is sort of a lot harder.
I wanted to ask you about rape. Rape happens all over the world. We saw in India recently in the news where rape is, you know, par for the course almost, relationships. In the Caribbean, do you think that rape comes out of our coloniality, where women were slaves, where women were, the whole story? Do you think there's a nexus between coloniality and rape, where the massa could get any slave he wanted at any time?
I think rape was a prominent feature of colonialism, especially during the enslavement period. Precisely as Hilary Beckles points out, because enslaved women were categorized as chattel, like enslaved men were, there was you couldn't legally charge a planter for raping and enslaved women, although we know rape was quite pervasive during the enslavement period. And beyond that, there was an interesting documentary that's produced about black women in the United States, in the south of the United States in the 40s and 50s, who 1940s and 50s, who when they made claims of rape to the police, their claims were invalidated because of the racism, the entrenched and overt and deep-seated racism that a black woman who claims rape against a white man, in many cases, either the cases weren't taken forward, and when there were questions around the sexual morality of that woman.
But that is happening today. Why is St. Vincent and the Grenadines, by the way, in your opinion, you may not have the facts or the figures, but from what you do know, why is St. Vincent so high on the we have 100 and, what's the figure?
The 112 per 100,000. I think the world average is 15 reported, 15 per 100,000.
So you have Philippines with a high number, I believe.
I think the Bahamas is probably the highest in the world. Now, there are a number of things operating there. Some might argue that it might mean that women are more likely in St. Vincent, places like Bahamas, to report rape because there is a high because there is an environment that facilitates reporting. But we also know that in spite of the reported cases of rape, most cases of rape are not reported. A person is most likely to be raped by someone known to them, family member, a neighbor, a friend, and so on. No more so within the familial social network structure. And a number of those cases of rape are actually statutory rape. So then you bring the dimension of age, the age distance between the perpetrator and the person who is victimized. So there are a number of things operating, and that I think there is far more work to be done to get an understanding of why we have such high levels of recorded rape. And there's also a lot of work to be done around public advocacy against and the state taking more serious. And there's work being done now. And if you want, we could talk about that a bit more. The Gender Affairs Division of the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we just completed a gender-based violence action plan, and a big component of that is to address the problem of rape against young women and children and women, which is rather high in the Caribbean.
You will certainly have to return to our studios, and we will find a way to continue this conversation, this narrative, this discussion, because it is absolutely important, because it reaches right to our identity. I think once we understand who we are, then a lot of our challenges will dissipate. Halimah DeShong, let me thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thanks. And it's always great to be home and to interact with my country people.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yes.
And we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jess.
Pleasure, our pleasure. I've been chatting with Halimah DeShong, PhD. She is a lecturer at the Cayville campus in Barbados in the area of gender studies. The studies continue. This is Unrendered. I'm Chester Connell. Thank you for joining us.